marketing teams of the organizations themselves. And so it's something that I really wonder about, and whether we can apply tools from the tech world, which are making everybody's lives much easier. We've already had some experience in that, and we are going to try to innovate and test it in a few cases. But I mean, I'd really be curious to understand how you incentivize and overcome those hurdles so that it is in fact useful, and resource-poor organizations implementing on the ground can make use of it in a more seamless way.
Who'd like to respond to that? Dave?
I can start, but maybe I should say something
and then
too.
perhaps ask Nina to come
So, well, thank you for that. And just to acknowledge, I remember talking years ago with the founder of Alphanar, Tariq Ben Halim, and he was very, when I was just beginning this journey and innovating, he was very supportive and very interested, and I'm sure he's watching us now happily. So this is a big issue, which is, I refer to this, what I think is the Uber shift from kind of 20th century development practice to something more real-time, not marching to 18-month blueprints and reporting against log frames in a kind of structured way, but moving to this adaptive, iterative management approach using real-time data. And by the way, using less data, because you can't, the burden on organizations to chase everything, they don't have the capacity, and it leads to, so I want to make two comments. One is horses for courses, which is the work identifying a very small number of KPIs, if you will, of things you're tracking, and then really rigorously managing to those and demonstrating that over time they actually correlate to improvements in outcomes. So in the customer satisfaction world, there's a relevant analogy, and I think business, again, has been ahead of us in this, because even though businesses have characteristically more resources and more ability to spend discretionary resources on management than nonprofits, they still struggle to get it all done, and they try to be very efficient. Customer satisfaction industry, born in the 60s, great idea, smart people building these companies, selling more and more and more questions, if you will, to companies. You can always think of smart questions to ask customers. And so throughout the 70s, the surveys got longer and longer and longer, and the industry grew. And then in the early 90s, a very smart consultant at Bain named Fred Reichheld was listening to his companies, the companies that were his clients, and they were complaining about these huge surveys and all this data which they couldn't deal with. And he was listening to the customers who were saying, we're sick and tired of these long forms. And he said, what if there were one question that you could ask and actually drive to manage your performance? And you've probably all heard of this, but if you haven't, he developed a movement called the Net Promoter Score. But you certainly answered the question that he found after 10 years of work. Anybody want to tell me the question?
Would you recommend it to a friend?
There you go. Would you recommend this company, would you recommend Keystone Accountability to a friend or colleague? The recommend question, he called it the ultimate question, wrote a series of books. Anyway, now thousands and thousands of companies have dropped the long surveys and are just asking this one question. It's highly benchmarked. So one of the problems with your grantee surveys, both of you, I suspect, is you don't have benchmarks. So you think your time on your application process is getting better, but you don't actually know if it's good or not because you can't see it within a broader experience. And so part of this is having all the fuller, if you will, metrics or measurement infrastructure around things like having benchmarks and stuff like that. So anyway, long story short, now companies are collecting much less information in a systematic way that burdens the data collection process, and then they're using it in different ways to go deeper and understand what's really going on in the customer experience. So we're in that shift, and our goal at Keystone is to try to reduce the actual collection burden and take the energy that's released there and turn it into deeper dive investigations and learning and dialogue with those you serve so you can really get to it. So I hope that's the direction this is going to go. And the tech is really helpful too.
Nina, do you want to?
Sure.
Yeah. No, that's great. I mean, there's so many important themes that have been raised on this. I mean, I guess from our perspective, there are a few things. One, I think kind of picking up on I think both of your points about how do you incentivize these kind of practices in your grantees. I think one of the things that we've learned from doing these beneficiary feedback pilots under GPAF UKA Direct is the organization that manages those grants, Triple Line Consulting. You know, they've really developed a whole set of practices that really encourage their grantees to be systematic about this, and I hope to be more than 7% collecting beneficiary feedback. You know, they really look at it from, you know, how is it in the proposal, how is it in the reports, how is it in their, you know, in their closeout and evaluations. And it's interesting to look at. We're doing a small case study on it. It doesn't take a whole lot, but what it does is it's a signal from DFID and from the organization managing it that this is important. And I think that for me is an important part of it, is really that organization leadership signaling that actually this isn't just a fluffy thing that we want to see in a gray box somewhere at the bottom of your report. We really want to see that you are changing things and doing things in response to that. So I think that there are really practical things that can be done for foundations and grant makers. I think another point on this issue of M&E is really interesting. I mean, one of my kind of comments that I make internally is what I call the M&E ghetto, which people don't really like. But I think the challenge that we find with traditional monitoring and evaluation is that you're asking the questions that you know you want the answers to. You know, you're tracking what you know you want to know. What you're not tracking is what you don't know, or as one of my compatriots have said, you know, the unknown unknowns. And I think that's where the beneficiary feedback really adds value. And I find it quite interesting talking to M&E professionals and trying to get them excited about it, because I think they often just want to track the things that they see in log frames that they know is going to sort of meet their key indicators. And I think that kind of gets us into tunnel vision. So I think that's, for us, kind of a key question, which leads me to kind of another area that we're looking at a lot right now, which is adaptive programming. And I think this is sort of a buzz across international development, but really I think we're starting to, you know, now in 2015, throw out the log frames and recognize that a lot of sort of, you know, transformative social change isn't going to happen in a linear process. But if you throw out the log frame, that also means that you need to have good quality iterative processes of finding out what's happening. And again, I think that's an area where people are starting to look to beneficiary feedback as a potential, you know, one of the many sources of information in there. And maybe one kind of final point on that is what David alluded to. You know, I think there's, you know, for us, there's also an issue of who should be collecting the beneficiary feedback, right? You know, clearly we expect most of it to be our implementing partners, but are there times in which DFID itself should be undertaking that? And I think there's sort of two areas that we're looking at there. You know, one is in conflict areas and in hard to reach areas. You know, we are looking at independent monitoring, and I think there's a lot of really interesting learning there about you know, having third-party monitors going out and doing, you know, beneficiary feedback and traditional monitoring, but just going to places that, you know, we can't reach, and, you know, where we want a little bit more rigor on what's being done. So I think that's one area. There's a lot of innovation. And the second area is part of what we're doing with David in Zambia is looking at, you know, and we're calling it sort of spot checking in some ways, but checking is the wrong word, because it's, so I need to think about kind of a better terminology there. But the idea being, you know, that, you know, in programs that are trying something new, that have recently made an investment in a certain area and want to see it, you know, are there a couple questions that we can ask in those target communities, just kind of on a, you know, on an ad hoc basis in this sort of micro survey way, just to get a feel of how things are going. I think this, you know, this is a conversation we're having internally, again with M&E professionals, which is, you know, when do you need to have rigorous results, and when do you need to just get a sense of how things are going? And I think often, you know, we struggle with, don't let, what's the expression, don't let perfect be the enemy of the good. You know, sometimes it's enough just to go and do some micro surveys and to get a sense like, we just spent a ton of money on this innovation, no one seems to know anything about it. Maybe we need to check it. And I think that's and you know, it doesn't need to be expensive. It can be, you can use technology, but it's about kind of thinking about the right questions, implementing them in the right way, and having a process that's ready to absorb them. So that's something we're testing now, and it'll be interesting to see how that comes through.
That's interesting. Do we have at this stage any more comments or questions about the beneficiary feedback from people's experience, or wanting to, question some of anything that people have been saying so far? Yes, Rob.
Hi, Rob Field here from the Big Lottery Fund. I think we're at quite an early stage of starting to address some of these issues. We've just published a new strategic framework earlier this year. And a couple of things you said really struck me. So one about this idea of throwing out the process book and getting back towards more kind of judgment-led decision-making and relationships and that kind of thing. And I guess one of the things we're really interested in is how we take that kind of feedback and actually involve people in the whole loop. So actually how we then work with them to co-design solutions to the problems that are being identified, and how we evaluate better and all of that stuff. And I think another thing that struck me was the comment you made around the kind of power relationship. So this kind of idea of fear of failure. So if we're asking projects and implementers to come up with innovative solutions to problems, how do we do more to make them feel comfortable saying this hasn't worked? And how do we build those relationships that you talked about being so important? So these are all the kind of things that we're starting to grapple with now.
Thank you. Because probably this then is the time we've talked about other sorts of evidence. I mean, obviously the key thing here, I think, Nina identified, how can we help donors and others make better decisions, I think is the sort of core of it. But we've also, we've mentioned participatory development, impact measurement, even log frames. There are many other sorts of, if you're talking about bringing evidence to donors, and, about the success of programs, beneficiary feedback is one type of evidence. There are others. So perhaps